tuned into an episode of Top of the Pops in the early 80s, you'd stand a very good chance of seeing someone playing a weird hexagonal drum kit. These were the Simmons electronic drums that were used by artists such as Def Leppard, Bill Bruford, Landscape, Genesis, The Police, Thomas Dolby, Spandau Ballet, Culture Club, Devo, Rush, Flock of Seagulls, Duran Duran, Queen, and many, many more. But today we're going to go back to a time before Simmons Electronics Limited was even formed and look at the original instrument that paved the way for what was to come. In 1978, Dave Simmons was working for a company called Musicaid in St Albans, Hertfordshire in the southeast of England. In his 2017 interview with Drum magazine, Simmons stated that in terms of synthesizers, there didn't seem to be anything happening in drums at the time. Experimenting with ARP synthesizers, Dave developed something the drummer in his band could hit to trigger a synthesized sound. This crude experiment paved the way for Dave's first purpose-built drum synthesizer, the SDS-3, launched in 1978. Now, this wasn't the first dedicated drum synth, as both Pollard and Star Instruments had already released the Syndrum and Synair respectively a few years earlier, but either way it wasn't exactly a market teeming with choice. In Dave Mattock's original review of the SDS-3, which I found on simmonsmuseum.com and is linked in the description, he says, "I'll be interested to see what the Japanese come up with, for example, but until that time it's pretty much down to these three models." The SDS-3 is an analog drum synthesizer with 4 channels for sounds and a 5th channel labelled Special Effects, which contains global tuning, an LFO, and a sample and hold circuit called Runtime. You can see by the coloured marking that the blue strips relate to discrete modulation for the individual channels, whilst the red strips denote global changes that affect all channels simultaneously. The SDS-3 came with pads built by drum manufacturer Premier, and these were connected via 5-pin DIN on the rear of the instrument. Unfortunately, the pads for my SDS-3 have long since been separated from the instrument, and so I don't have those to demonstrate. However, thankfully I don't need them in order to create sounds because each channel can be triggered via any incoming audio signal. The idea is that you mic up a drum, run the mic into the trigger input on the back, and then use the output jacks for both the incoming audio signal and the synthesized sound and mix them together so that the SDS-3 layers with the acoustic drums for a more interesting sound. And it's velocity sensitive as well. There is also a mono mix output, and the signal routing is normal so that the audio from both mic and synth sounds from each channel are heard. And the intention for it to supplement rather than replace acoustic drums is echoed in Dave Mattock's original review, where he says of the novelty sounds, struck once or twice at just the right point during a number, it can bring a different colour to a passage or tune. Played incessantly, or worse, played incorrectly, it is just tedious. He adds that it's not wrong to play time on them, just that it's an easy sound to abuse. Of course, the irony here is that a couple of years later, Roland's TR-808 drum machine employed analog subtractive synthesis to create its sounds, and went on to become arguably one of the most famous and most influential instruments of its generation. But I'm of course speaking with the benefit of hindsight. It's just interesting to know the opinion of a reviewer at the time. Starting at the top of each channel is a mic sensitivity setting and an on-off switch. The reason for this is not only to dial in the level required to trigger the channel, but also so that you can avoid other nearby drums or sounds from triggering it too. We then have a pitch dial to tune in the oscillator. The frequency range is pretty large and goes from down in the depths to bird tweet territory, and everywhere in between. Next to the pitch is an impact click knob that adds, well, an impact click to the sound. As you can see, this is a sharp momentary opening of the filter that is higher in frequency the more impact you add. Below that we have decay time that allows you to create tight and clicky sounds, long sustained sounds, and everywhere in between. Next to that we have a mix knob that allows you to choose white noise, the oscillator tone, or a mix of the two. Now here's a problem. The pitch dial doubles as a filter cutoff on the white noise. The point that you'd want this set for noise doesn't correlate with the oscillator tuning you'd want. So you can either have decent white noise mixed with an oscillator tuned way too high, or dull filtered noise with an oscillator tuned where you'd want it for a practical drum sound. So really it works as an either or rather than a usable means to mix oscillator and noise. Although it does have a use for hi-hat sounds. As I don't have another SDS-3 to compare this to, I'm not sure if this is an issue that only affects my particular unit or whether they are all like this. But either way, you can still create great sounds with either the noise or the oscillator. Just not really at the same time. Moving down, we have bend level, which is a preset envelope that modulates the frequency of the oscillator over time, with the bend level acting as the envelope amount. There is a switch to change the polarity of the envelope so you can bend the oscillator frequency up or down. With bend up, the frequency starts above its tuning and bends down, and with bend down, the frequency starts below its tuning and bends up. Finally, we have the effects section. Here we can modulate the oscillator frequency with the LFO found in channel 5 to the top right of the instrument. The LFO has two wave shapes, sine and square, and has a range from 0.2 Hz to 1 kHz, meaning that it can be used as a tone source or for audio rate modulation as well as low frequency modulation. Last but not least, we have the runtime modulation, which is located at the bottom of channel 5. I assume the runtime samples its voltages from a sine wave because the resultant frequency modulation moves down and up, and the runtime itself defines how long it does that for before it resets to the original frequency. The hold time is re-triggered by the incoming audio signals or the pads if you've got them. The only other features are the overall pitch slider, which is a global tuning control, and this can also be controlled via the pitch pedal input on the rear of the instrument. Next to that are decay kill and mic input on and off, which are both controlled by foot switches. And that's basically it, so we'll make some beats. One little note, I'm running a Sequential Circuits drum tracks through the SDS-3 to trigger it, but also in place of an acoustic drum kit, using it as nature intended to supplement real drum sounds, so you're hearing both the sequential drum tracks and the Simmons SDS-3 together. Whilst at Musicaid, Dave Simmons also created the cut-down 2-channel SDS-4 and the Claptrap, which was an analog clap synthesizer. Richard Burgess of Landscape got his hands on a Simmons SDS-3 and began collaborating with Dave Simmons to develop its successor, the SDS-V, which was released in 1981. And that was the hexagonal kit that you probably saw on top of the Pops. But that's another story for another time. For now, you can enjoy the sounds of the SDS-3 via the free sample pack and Kontakt instrument linked in the description. Thank you for watching.